This is Greg Canty here, and welcome to the Win Happy podcast. Stay tuned for interesting chats with interesting people about winning their lives and being happy at the same time. This show has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with marital therapist, author of I Love You, But I'm Not in Love With You, and the host of the Meaningful Life podcast, Andrew G. Marshall. At the beginning of each year, we typically make resolutions about our weight, our fitness, or our professional lives. But do we ever take time to reflect on our core personal relationships and attempt to improve these? I asked Andrew to take on this topic, and he provided 5 practical hacks to improve your relationships, as well as asking me some big questions about being happily pissed off. Let's hear from Andrew. A huge welcome to Andrew G. Marshall to the Win Happy podcast. And Andrew, I'm so excited. You're an author, a marital therapist, and that familiar voice to me, the host of the Meaningful Life podcast. It is wonderful. I discovered it towards the end of last year, and I think it is so enjoyable, so practical, so relevant. And before anyone has heard one word from you, I'm encouraging all of my listeners to tune in immediately. The last episode you had was so interesting about the role of women in our lives and how that can shape our life, women's opinion about men, and how that can change that whole dynamic. I'm very interested in it. I've become a grandfather recently. And
congratulations.
Yeah, thank you so much. And between COVID and everything else, my son has had the rare opportunity, an opportunity that most men don't get, to be very much a co-parent for that early period in Hazel's life. And I think for most of us, that's denied, with maternity leave, and the mother takes 6 months. In Ireland, it actually ends up being pretty much 9 months to a year, where the mother nearly has exclusive access to this baby. And of course, the man or the partner ends up going to work every day and having quite a different relationship with the child. And I think that changes everything. That particular episode, like the other ones, there's something gold in every one of them. I thought it was so interesting.
Thank you.
So there's so much I want to talk to you about at the beginning of this year. I know some of your books. My wife doesn't love me anymore. How can I ever trust you again? I know the topics that you cover in your practice and everything else. You cover infidelity, sexual problems, personal development. And in the context of a new year, I'd like to get into some of that. But something I do on all of these recordings, Andrew, is I like the listener to have a sense of the person before we get into the topic. So I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Who the hell are you and where did you come from?
So I came from a small town in the middle of England, from the middle classes, and a sort of very middling in every kind of way you could possibly imagine. The thing that was different in my family was actually, in many ways, this isn't different from a lot of middle-class families. We never talked about anything that was truly important. In particular, feelings. So, my mother, who was a wonderful conversationalist, could talk to anybody about anything, but it would be much more likely to be the weather and how did you get here sort of kind of questions rather than who the hell are you type of questions. So obviously feelings were something that were incredibly interesting to me. Forbidden things are always the most interesting. And I've dedicated my life, it turns out, to talking about feelings. First of all, with my clients in my therapy room, then in my books, and now to the whole world every week on The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall. So I've gone from being a small town boy in the middle of nowhere. I'm still in the middle of nowhere. I'm not in the middle of Europe now, but I've become a big city boy. So at the age of 59, I left England and went and moved to Germany so that I could sort of have another adventure. And I promise you, living in Berlin is a big adventure.
It's a wonderful city. I've just visited once. There's something edgy about it. There's something very interesting about it. There's something very open about it. Your mum and your dad, what do they do?
Unfortunately, they're both dead now. My father was an accountant, and my mother was originally a teacher. She taught physical education. But as was the case when I was born, right back in 1959, women tended to give up their jobs when they had a child. And my mother went back to part-time teaching, but she dedicated herself to bringing us up, which on one level was wonderful. But and she never actually said these words, you've got to do something good if, I've put all this energy into you. But I always felt that, she was a woman of huge energy, and she put her energy into me and my sister. And, I always felt that, I had to do well, I had to perform, which the theme of this podcast is to win happy. I don't think performing is generally going to make you happy. So I've tried to undo some of that programming.
And Andrew, the conversations at the kitchen table in your middle of nowhere in England with parents who didn't talk about feelings. What were the topics at the kitchen table?
Well, sport was very popular. My father was a rugby player. My mother played a wide variety of sports. I mean, they both played sports forevermore. How you're doing at school, politics sometimes, but very little in the way of politics. Just the usual stuff of life, the garden, the neighbours, just generally what you'd hear in any family when they're not talking about the things they should be talking about.
And when the young Andrew is sitting in school and for whatever reason, the teacher has lost your attention, where do you go in your head?
Oh, I was a huge reader, so I would probably be disappearing into the book that I was reading at the time.
Okay. Were you choosing your own books, were you?
Yes, I'm afraid to say I had very narrow tastes. And I actually read a book by this author again just recently in German because, when you're learning a foreign language, often it's easier to read children's books. So I thought, I haven't read a book from this author since I was, 10 years old. I wonder if I'll enjoy it now. And I was horrified about how bad it actually was. And that author was Enid Blyton.
Oh my goodness. She did okay, didn't she?
She did incredibly well. I literally read nothing but Enid Blyton from, I don't know, when I first started reading with Noddy, all the way through to suddenly, there were no more Enid Blyton books to read, and I was too old for the Famous Five and the Secret Seven. And I read everything. I read Mallory Towers, absolutely everything she probably ever wrote.
Yeah, because as different as we think we are, we're so similar. I think we all grew up on that diet of Enid Blyton, plus the Secret Seven and the Famous Five, and there was a dog as well, wasn't there? And one of them,
Timmy.
Timmy. And the same comics and the same annuals and everything else. We were so similar, and it was so simple as well. So that path to what you're doing now and that career path, could you give me the whistle-stop tour of what your thinking was leaving school and where it brought you to today?
Okay, so I originally wanted to be a radio presenter, so I'm using those old skills again. And on a radio station called Essex Radio, which surprisingly enough was in Essex, I suggested that we hosted a program called Lifeline. It was on a Sunday night, and I had a panel of experts who would deal with people's personal problems. And everybody said I was really good at helping people. Well, I wasn't. What I would do was I would draw the listener out who'd got the problem, pass him over to the experts, there were a panel of 3 people, and then I would summarize what the people had actually said to get them off because we need to get somebody else on. And little did I know, those are sort of two of the main counselling therapy skills, drawing people out and summarising their learning. And I thought, I think I might do a bit of this because, and this sounds really weird, radio had been my hobby. I turned it into my profession and I felt a little bit one-dimensional. So I thought, well, I'll do this as a sideline. And I trained with Relate, which actually then had volunteer counsellors. So I volunteered. And over time, I just did more and more. And eventually I left radio and became a therapist. And then I used to write, so my original training was a journalist. I used to write newspaper articles. I wrote a newspaper article about a phenomenon I'd seen in my practice. Somebody had come in to me and said, "I love you, but I'm not in love with you." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I wrote a newspaper article about it, and it was spotted by somebody, and they said, would I write a book on the topic?
Oh, so that was your first book?
My first book was I Love You, But I'm Not in Love with You, 7 Steps to Saving Your Relationship. And it sold in 20 languages all over the world. And suddenly I was a full-time therapist. And here I am today. I've sort of come round a full circle. I don't do therapy all the time now. I do my podcast as well. So I used to do a lot of radio and a bit of therapy, and now I do a lot of therapy and a bit of podcasting.
That mix is nice, isn't it? I think with everything that we do, it's good not to be just full on one thing and have a little bit of diversity. Do you enjoy that?
Yeah. What? Because you obviously have a business as well as your podcast. What's your business?
Yeah, we have a full service marketing and communications agency called Fusion Communications. And it's wonderful. Now, I must admit, the objective in our business is for our clients to get their messages out there. And if you can imagine, my other half, Deirdre, started that business back in 2000. Very traditional. You've got your newspapers, your radio, your TV. And then, of course, around 2009, social media came crashing into the mix. So very, very quickly, you had to get on board with all this new media. And now as time has moved on again, I could see the opportunity around podcasts. And I thought, this is another way to get your message out to clients in quite a different, intimate, authentic way. So I said, let's start my own podcast as a little bit of learning. Now, I've been doing this for 5 years. Actually, my own dad passed away about 5 years ago. So it was a really good idea to jump into something, I think, to kind of help me through that time. 250 episodes later, we're producing podcasts now for clients. A clever thing for them to add to the mix. But I must admit, I absolutely love it. I love having conversations with people.
Yeah. When my father died, I put in lots of additions about bereavement and loss and what better thing to do that because nearly always the stuff that is in our life that's a problem for us is often a problem for other people. And so while I'm thinking, I could really do with a program on X topic, 9 times out of 10, most of my listeners could do with exactly the same topic as well. So I think that it's really powerful that way.
Yeah. And a lot of the time, Andrew, I think it's personal and the professional at times just sitting together. And just while we're on that topic of bereavement, one of the other, I know you're a writer. I've been writing for a long time. I've been blogging and that. And I find it's a good way to process some of the things that are going on in your life. If I look back at it, they're nearly diary entries as much as anything. And when my father did pass away, I had to write the eulogy. And I was thinking, the best thing I could do was actually write a blog post. And I do that on WordPress. And without prejudice, when I hit the publish button, it automatically pushes it to Twitter, to Facebook, and to LinkedIn. And the audiences on each of those platforms are quite different. Facebook is quite personal. Twitter, I'm not sure how we describe it, probably sits in the middle. And LinkedIn is that very much business to business one. I would say without a doubt, and I've got good followers on all of those platforms, the response I got from LinkedIn, a lot of your professional colleagues around the bereavement of a parent was incredible. And I remember I was chatting to my landlord in Dublin, and a very stern guy. He's a solicitor and he's on the top floor. And, you know, in a way, we're his tenant, he's our landlord, you know, so we're not chit-chatting every day or anything. The most meaningful conversation we had was in the corridor one day when he had heard the news about my father and he started talking to him about his. And back to your conversation about feelings, I think it gave him permission to revisit a conversation that is obviously very deep for him, and for me to explore something that was very fresh in my mind. And maybe back to what you're saying about our reluctance to talk about feelings. And I think a lot of the time, I think the guys are worse than anyone for doing that.
Well, I wrote my father's eulogy too, and I wrote the first half of it with him to sort of, in the sense of, you know, Tony was born here, he did this, the sort of basic CV kind of stuff, because my father was 91 when he died. And so there was nobody else to ask about all of these things. And he was somebody who liked to get everything straight.
He's the accountant.
So and, you know, so I got right that he actually, all I felt I had to put quite a bit about being an accountant in, you know, and he worked for these kinds of companies, but he wanted to cut that all out because actually at the end, it didn't matter to him. What really mattered was all the rugby. So, you know, it had a lot of rugby in it. And I said to him, and this is the point where I'm going to say nice things about you. Do you want me to write them down now so you can actually hear them? And I thought he'd say, oh, yes, okay. And he said, no. So here was the chance for him to hear what I was going to say at his funeral, because I knew I was going to say what I admired the most about him. And he didn't actually want to hear that, which actually at this precise moment I'm feeling a little bit sad about, but that was his choice. It was sort of, we're too English, we're too middle class to have feelings, so let's parcel them all away.
Well, maybe you can now write the eulogy you meant to deliver that day and publish it as a blog post, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, that one day my book about my father will be finished and it will be in there. You know, I wrote everything I wanted to say about him and I delivered it at his funeral as he would have wanted. But I think it was also that he was a very modest man. He couldn't deal with a compliment.
I've got an interesting perspective on accountancy and marketing because I actually started off life as an accountant. I think when you're an accountant, you tell the story of a business. And a lot of the time you're doing that in arrears, the story last month, the story last year, the story the last 5 years. Okay, sometimes you're budgeting and you're trying to predict the financial story into the future. As a person who was very interested in business, my motivation all of the time was to get more involved. So I went from practice into industry because I wanted to get into the thick of it. And then when it came to teaming up with my wife, Deirdre, over 20 years ago, suddenly you were in the business of making stories and being a key part of it and pushing stories out for our clients. And of course, podcasting, what a fantastic medium to do that. So our topic today, it's obviously the start of a year. And I'm not sure whether you're a New Year's resolution guy or a revolution. Sometimes I like to think about them. And they tend to be about the business or about our health. And I think very, very seldom, from my experience in talking to people, do we talk about our relationships and the ones that are most important to you, the ones you have with your other half or your partner, be it male or female or whatever. It's a bit like your football team, you know, getting back to sport, and you hear everyone saying, you need to get the core of the team right, you know, the goalkeeper, the central defenders, your core midfielder, because the rest of the team doesn't function about that. In terms of those core relationships, what would you say to me, Andrew, at the beginning of a year, if you really wanted to roll the sleeves up about how to address some of these things and the importance of them.
I love your analogy of the team and the core elements, because what's really interesting is that when I'm working with couples, they often report that their children, although we basically don't talk about the children unless, it's about they're having an argument about the children, that they report their children are much happier, much more relaxed as they become relaxed, that somehow you're right. The husband-wife relationship is the core relationship. And if that's working, then everything else, the whole team is working together much better. And one of the sad things is people sort of take that core for granted and they put all the energy outwards, either to job or to children, and the center hollows out. And that is a bit of a disaster, because that is what tends to get you into "I love you, but I'm not in love with you" territory, where, I like you, I want the best for you, but actually I don't feel our lives are intimately connected. And I've got sort of 5 ideas to start the new year with. And if you take up just one of these, you will do well. If you take up all 5 of them, I'll come round to your house and give you a gold star.
Well, let's go for it. And before you get into, there's an expression I use, and I talk about being happily pissed off. And what I mean is that sometimes we allow ourselves drift into a situation that isn't great, and we know it's not great, but it's familiar to ourselves. I come in that same door every day and I walk on the same carpet and I say hello to the same people. We fight about the same things, but there's a bit of comfort in that familiarity. So I think a lot of us end up living in that happily pissed off frame of mind until something happens, like you meet someone in the workplace or someone turns your eye somewhere and you're open to a change, and suddenly the pin is taken out of the grenade and it's boom.
Can I just go straight into the very first of the skills on the back of what you've just said, because it's called a listening skill. And what you do is you reflect back what the other person has just said. So I'm just going to do that just now. So what you've just said is that you feel often, there's a great phrase called happily pissed off, because you can drift into the familiar, having the same sort of fights, and it's not too bad. There's a sort of comfort there, and you can live there until something happened. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And how did it feel that I reflected back what you'd just said?
Yeah, well, straight away I feel like I was totally understood.
And that you were heard.
Yeah.
And the next part is, once I've checked that you've heard me correctly, I say, tell me more about this. And the reason why tell me more are the 3 most beautiful words in the English language. Not I love you. I mean, those are fabulous words, but tell me more is even better, because it's very easy to say I love you, but to actually hear your partner when they're probably telling you something you don't want to hear, and you actually say, so these are all your complaints about my untidiness. And instead of me giving 7 reasons why I'm okay or why you're wrong, I'm saying, actually, I'm hearing that you're upset about A, B, and C. And you're saying, yes, that's right. And I'm saying, I'm then giving you the invitation to tell you even more about your upset. I mean, that is the most loving and generous thing. It says, I'm prepared to listen to you, even if you're saying things I don't want to hear. And this is so important, because often when the other person is talking, what you're doing is either you're trying to get in to interrupt them. And I'm sorry I did interrupt you, but you reached the point of how much I could take in one go. But you're either waiting to get in, or you're trying to get in, or you're thinking up, all the reasons why they're wrong. And so you're not actually properly hearing them. And sort of 50% of problems disappear if you actually listen to your partner. But listening is really difficult. And it also reflects the importance of not just listening, but when you're speaking, not giving too much material at the same time, not what I'd call chunking. So if you give people a huge chunk of information, they get to the point where they can't digest all of it. I could digest what you said and, I could really reflect on it. But there comes a point where I just lose some of your points, which are often really good points. So there's two parts to it. You learn to actually communicate in chunks that your partner can, or bits that your partner can digest. And secondly, you truly listen, and it actually slows down the communication, which 9 times out of 10 is a benefit because there are fewer misunderstandings.
So is that your number one recommendation?
My number one is improve your listening skills.
Okay.
Everybody thinks they're great at listening, but they're not.
Yeah. And with that magical question, which is nearly proof that I've listened to you by asking that question, the tell me more question.
There's two parts of it. Your partner tells you something and saying, I heard you say, I'm hearing, and then you, as much as possible, use their own words, because it really shows, happily pissed off is very different from being upset. So don't paraphrase it. Use their own words. It makes it easier as well. Then say, is that right? And they will correct you if you've got it wrong.
I'm just giggling here, Andrew, and I'm just imagining a conversation between my wife and her good friend. I'm very worried about Greg. I came in the other day giving out about stuff, and he actually stopped and took a breath. And he actually asked me, tell me more. She said, yeah, is he okay? I'm very worried about him.
He's been mixing with those dangerous people on podcasts
again. Okay, that's simple and that's brilliant. Can I just put something else in there?
Mm-hmm.
And I think in relationships that have gone on for a long time, where we've nearly got to the point of we're just accepting everything. Do you know what I mean? And we're not even raising some of these things that annoy us anymore as issues, because we've come to that point where, what's the point? Do we need to do a little bit of a stock take about ourselves? And, are there things, maybe surface things, or things that could be an awful lot deeper, that really are bothering you? And over time, you've just fallen into pattern of accepting those things and thinking this is just the way it is, and I'll just sit in this happily pissed off moment. Do you know what I mean? Do you need to do a bit of reflecting? And one of those things could be, well, I need to listen more to my wife. But is part of that a little bit of looking in the mirror and saying, well, there's a bunch of things here that are kind of undermining me in some way, and I don't want to be happily pissed off anymore. I want to be happy.
Yeah. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you a question.
This is good.
Is there something, now we're sitting here and you're talking about and you're asking this question. Let's assume you're asking this question because you actually want an answer to it. When you look deep inside you, is there something that you're happily pissed off about that actually really you're just straightforward pissed off about, and you've just been suppressing that and trying to push it to one side? If there's one thing you could change, what would it be?
Oh, wow. Okay, cheekers. Okay, very, very simple. Yeah. Let's make more time for just you and me in our week.
Okay.
Instead of that pattern of home, have dinner, turn on the telly, dogs come in, feed them, fall asleep watching something, and off you go to bed and you start again tomorrow.
Yeah, excellent. So I'm going to skip to my next point exactly on that. And when there is something we want different, it's very easy to start thinking about all the things your wife does that actually gets you into that kind of position. Maybe she's spending a lot of time on talking to her mates on the telephone or something like that, so there's less time for you or whatever. You can think of, I'm sure, 10 things that your wife could do differently that would facilitate that. But the question is, what can I do differently? Now, because you can't actually, if you're trying to change your wife, good luck on that. But there is one person you can change, and that's you. You've got 100% access to that. So what could you do differently in the evening? So I think I want an answer on that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, maybe reach for the remote control and ask the question, do you mind if we just listen to music tonight and have a chat? And off it goes. Now, again, she might be looking at me strange and thinking, I definitely need to talk to my neighbour next door or my good buddy. Maybe he has had a lobotomy after all. But I do suspect that would.
My question then would be, why is she talking to the woman next door so much about you and not to you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, okay. So, and I don't think she chats to the woman next door. I'm just kind of saying that and maybe joking just a little bit, which probably is another little defense mechanism, if I'm being honest. We talk about some of these things and Greg goes to joke mode a tiny bit, which is probably a little defense thing, whatever. But she probably would be, I think she'd be pleasantly surprised. I'll be honest with you. I think she'd be very pleasantly surprised if I was to do that. And she might comment to her best friend, there's been a few nice changes recently. We're getting on better, because I think if there were issues in the relationship, I'm sure she would talk to her best friend or her sister, for example. Yeah. And I could imagine that conversation. I could.
I've actually got another interesting question for you. I mean, you'd have to be really brave to ask this question. What would you tell your sister about me that you might not speak directly to me about?
Yeah, probably intimate things, I would guess.
Mm-hmm.
I would.
But these are not intimate things in her life.
Yeah.
These are intimate things about you. So she's much more likely to, she's fed up with you putting your feet on the table, sort of kind of thing, and she's fed up with telling you, and she gets absolutely nowhere with it, and she lets off steam to her sister, for example. So this is what you can't speak to me about me, but you speak to your sister about. Because, her personal stuff, it might be, she might need to speak to another woman about it. So sort of get it in her head clear, sort of kind of thing. And it might be things you don't have any particular experience about. But often we speak to our best friend about our partner, and we don't actually then speak to our partner about the things we've spoken to our best friend that are upsetting us. And so what are the things about me that you can't speak to me about, but would speak to your best friend about?
I think invariably it would end up being things that involve the other person. And you're afraid of crossing the threshold of a topic that might be upsetting or might even lead to a fight or someone closing up a little bit, things that you feel, I don't have permission to talk about them. Maybe that's stating that in the wrong way, but might be uncertainty as to how it might be received, or the topic, it just involves that person a little bit too much, so it's just too difficult,
So that's my second tip. What can I do differently? So instead of going off into all the 10 things that your wife or your husband can do differently, I mean, I'm sure you could get to 30 of those. What can I do differently? Generally, we tend to come up with only one. I could sort of give up. And that's the one answer isn't acceptable. I could change my attitude to it, even if you can't actually change something because it's not in your gift. You can look at your attitude and see, if your attitude and the way you're dealing with it is actually making it worse. So there's always something you can do differently. And it's really important to look at that. What's actually in your control, and what's generally in our control is our behavior and our reactions. So that would be my second one. And third one is, and this was originally going to be my last one, but they're sort of coming up in the order that they're coming up sort of just organically.
Excellent.
And with everything, it's always better to try and go deeper rather than just keep on having the same argument, which is, I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, 90% of all arguments fit into this category. And if you think that the next time round you're going to convince your wife that she's wrong and you're right, or she thinks she's going to convince you that she's right and you're wrong, I think you're living in cloud cuckoo land. But I've never nobody's ever in my room in 30 years actually turned around and said, do you know, you're right.
There's a friend of mine who was a solicitor, and he said in his profession, he was being paid to argue. And he used to bring that home. And when he would fight with his wife, he was trying to win the argument. and he said it took him a while to realize, I'm not at work now. There should be a discussion, not an argument that you need to win. And
so if the argument is going round and round in circles, which is how I'm right and you're wrong goes, or you just go on to other topics to fight in different arenas, the question is, what is this argument really about? And why I was prompted with this is you said that I often use humour to deflect from the issue. So the going deeper on that, I mean, first of all, I'd obviously say, tell me more, but we haven't got time for that probably. But why do you feel that need?
To introduce humour into something?
Yeah.
But sometimes I do see the funny side in situations.
Yeah.
And I think it's a natural way with me.
But it's also a defense mechanism.
Yeah, no,
it
is a defense mechanism. I do know that. For example, yesterday we were sitting down to have some of our ongoing conversations with team members, some of our colleagues. And sometimes, if you're raising a tough issue or whatever, it's a defense mechanism, definitely. It'll also, at times, I think I'll use it as a tactic to relax the conversation. So, I'm talking to you about something serious and I've got an issue here. I do want to create an atmosphere around it that takes the stress out of us being able to have a straight conversation. So sometimes humor can just kind of pull that down a little bit. But it's funny, in some of those conversations, and yesterday in particular, it was both myself and my wife Deirdre, my business partner, who was having this kind of conversation with some of our senior colleagues. And I get the little look from her, and we're a good balance for each other, And that's the other challenge, I guess, we would have personally, if you talk about us, because we work together and we're obviously husband and wife. But she gives me that little look, which I know 100% is like, yeah, please don't introduce that little bit of humor right now where we're having a serious conversation, because you're actually, I think in her words, she would say, you're actually reducing the seriousness of it, which isn't appropriate. And sometimes I think it enables the conversation in a more relaxed way. And it's probably right and wrong on both sides. But we have an understanding about that. We wouldn't have a conversation about that after. That wouldn't be required, unless either of us thought, yeah, you went too far. Do you know what I mean? So we would discuss things in that context, yeah, but very positively. This is a real therapy session, Andrew. I wasn't prepared for this, but it's good. How much do you charge?
So we've got improve your listening skills, reflect back what somebody said. Is that right? Tell me more. Thinking, what could I do differently about this thing? When you're stuck, going that next stage deeper, what is this argument really about? And, actually ask that question and, don't think, don't just give your answer, the two of you together, because it might be about power for you and it might be about something different for your partner. It might be feeling taken for granted that is actually driving it for that person. And 99 times out of 100 at the deeper level, it can be sorted out. It's really just at the top level when you're trying to win the argument where the problem is. Another one is, what would happen if you imagined that every word your partner said was true? Now, I'm not saying forever, but just for 5 minutes as they're talking, if they say this is really upsetting, you actually say to yourself, not, here's 5 reasons why you shouldn't be upset with me. You actually imagine what it's like to be in this person's shoes, that actually when they're telling you it's upset, they're actually telling you it because this is a real weird idea, but they are genuinely upset. And so we're going to imagine that every word is true without the brackets. I'm upset, but I have no right to be because I'm always upset. Or, I've been so good for the last 3 weeks, you've got no right to be upset. Or I did this for you yesterday, so you've no right to be upset. You don't put those brackets behind. You just actually, for a moment, imagine that every single word they say is true. And often, you're both right. So don't compete for who's right and who's wrong, but just imagine for a second that your partner is genuinely upset about this. And if they are genuinely upset, is there something that you would like to do differently? And generally, if you imagine that every word your partner says is true, generally, and you give them that beautiful gift, you'll find in general they'll do the same for you.
I know what you're saying. And is that all about just getting into that person's frame of mind and trying to soak up their perspective?
Yes.
Before just, flying off your handle with what you believe to be true, and suddenly it is that argument.
I'm talking in particular about stuff to do in your relationship, less about COVID isn't real. When they're actually upset about something or they feel that you've done something wrong, instead of defending yourself, and you can defend yourself later, let's just imagine that they're upset and their opinion is valid.
Yeah. Okay.
And, if you love them, they must have something going for them. So let's, give them 5 minutes of imagining that how they see the world is valid and true. And you just step into their shoes and see what is different.
Yeah.
And that really, we spend so much time in our own head with our own pains and whatever. They're always going to be much more real to us than somebody else's. I know I'm stating the obvious, but it's really quite useful to be able from time to time just to step outside and think, let's just imagine for the next 5 minutes that every single word my partner says is 100% true.
So if you are upset about that thing, that gives us a really strong platform to be able to have a conversation about it. At least I can relate to you a little bit better because I'm coming from a place where I understand that is what you believe and that is what you feel is true. And that is what's bothering you. Yeah.
And somebody's feelings are true. If somebody is upset, they are the world's expert on themselves. And to tell somebody you're not upset or discount what they're saying, you're then inadvertently telling them that they have no right to be upset.
Yeah.
It was only one glass I left on the side, so you can't have the right to be angry about it.
Yeah. Okay.
And then my 5th idea is to ask questions rather than assuming. And I mean, it's one of the things I say a huge amount of times. Could you turn that into a question, please? So somebody will say, the problem with you is ... And you can imagine if, I say the problem with Greg is he's always making jokes all the time. And what's your reaction to that? You're going to get defensive, aren't you?
Yeah.
So instead, you ask a question. You turn that into a question, which is what I did, is why do you tell jokes all the time? And, you've told me it's to give a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And so, I might I see that differently. And the problem is, after we've been with somebody for 20 years, we assume we know absolutely everything about them. But they've changed over the last 20 years. So you might need to update a little bit.
Yeah, and you might have changed yourself into the bargain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So don't assume, ask a question. And my favorite type, if you have to, I don't want lawyers' questions, which are sort of leading questions where you're trying to get to your answer. Is the reason you're always angry because you have a short temper and you have zero patience with people? That's a leading barrister's question. Even if you end up asking a yes/no question, that's better than just assuming. But my favorite questions are ones that start who, why, what, when, how. So they're open questions. So, and if it's a really curious question, you really genuinely want to know the answer rather than to prove a point, that's much, much better.
So to recap, tell me more and improve our listening skills. Look at ourselves and try to figure out what I can do differently. Try to go deeper on those topics and not let things be on the surface. For a moment, when your partner, that important person in your life, when they're talking about an issue, just imagine for a second that everything that they're saying is absolutely true. And instead of just jumping back at something, start asking questions. That sounds like a really positive recipe for a relationship. And you do this for a living, Andrew.
Yep.
And over 35 years, am I correct?
I think I might have got the calculation wrong. Yes, it might be 35 years now. Yes.
When this happens, and you see couples all day, every day, and I know you deal with individuals as well, what changes?
I think the whole mood lightens. There's much more curiosity around. And we hold things just a little less close to ourselves. And then if you're holding things a little less close to yourself, you're just a little bit more open with each other. And that's a beautiful thing to be. It's sort of weird, but the better you know people, the harder it is to be open with them because, the stakes get higher and higher. And it's really easy just to hide behind, Netflix and a glass of wine.
And what happens with the children?
What happens with the children? Well, hopefully you'll be modeling really good things because if you're doing this with your children too, you're imagining when they come home and they're telling you all these bad things about the teacher, maybe they're true.
Yeah.
And, why are you having so many problems with this teacher? Let's hear that.
And what happens when you go into work and you can be part of an organization, have a role, you might be the leader in a business. When that core is right, what happens then when you go into work in a better frame of mind? There's a bit more contentment, there's less friction and everything else.
What I often see is people can do all of this stuff at work. It's actually bringing it home that's the problem, not the other way around.
Yeah.
That, I think this is one of the things of lockdown is people heard their partners in their Zoom meetings and they thought, my gosh, this person's really nice. Why don't I see this person at home so much?
Actually, that specific thing has been said to me more than once. You're in the middle of a big to-do. Your neighbor knocks on the door and you go switch into being nice mode. And why couldn't you have been like that with me? You say, okay, good question.
So I have to say I have zero interest in how you're going to be doing at work, but I'm sure it'll be fine.
I'm actually thinking very sadly when we're having this conversation. There was a place where I was working a long time ago. We were in an open office. There was a purchasing department. There was an accounting department. There were some other functions operating there. There was one particular character who headed up the purchasing department. And she was a lightning bitch. She used pound into the office the atmosphere in the office used to change within the blink of an eye. You were waiting for her to lash out at one of her own team members or one of her other colleagues in one of the other departments. And I had her written off. I had her put in that category of just being this horrible, horrible person. And it turns out after she was going through a horrific breakup. And the woman I know now is a lovely, beautiful, positive person. And I think when you get that core right, all the other things function so much better. And, you know, if things are wrong in a relationship in some place, of course, I think it spills out into everything else. I've got a few questions for you, if that's okay.
Okay, yep.
That move to Berlin, why and what has it delivered for you?
Well, why? Number one was Brexit. I'd always wanted to experience another culture, because if you live in the middle of England, in the middle classes, and you know, you've been middle of everything, you tend to have one view of the world, and I wanted to have a different view of the world. And I had to go then because, I mean, the places I would wanted to go would be other European countries. And if I didn't leave then, I can't. If somebody's listening to this podcast in the United Kingdom, they can't just move to Germany like I did. So I had to do it then.
Yeah.
So it was to get a new perspective, because it's very easy to just sort of get in a rut and see things. I never realized that I lived on an island, if that makes any sense. I don't know if you know. Yeah. I mean, there's a clue in the name of your country, but you sort of think your own country is the center of the world. And in the United Kingdom, we really do think it is the center of the world. And it's quite useful to get an outside perspective. And there was also this sense very much of, if I didn't change now, I never would. And I felt that it was really important to have another big adventure.
Yeah, adventure is a great word, and I think it was quite exciting. Did it give you a new lease of life, a new energy?
Yes, I'm an entirely different person, I would say.
Okay, I love that. My second question for you, I've just a few. Tell me about the tattoo.
Oh, I was going to say that would be one of the things that was different. You know, in middle England I was the late 50s, but the middle of the 60s, the only people who had tattoos were sailors, soldiers, and builders. So not people like us. And I'm in this entirely different kind of world where, I mean, I was invited, for example, to take part in something called Naked Boys Reading. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be reading something that I've written myself, that's going to be pretty naked anyway. So that's the last thing I want to do, is get up on stage and read naked. And on the day it actually happened, I'd started writing something, and I had this huge desire to expose the idea to the public. And I thought to myself, you know, I came to Berlin to do different things. And so nudity is something that the Germans love taking their clothes off. So it's not so difficult. But for an Englishman, where the definition of being an Englishman is to be permanently embarrassed. So I went and read this piece about the problems of aging, naked in front of people where I was the oldest person in the room, most probably. And it felt absolutely wonderful. So that's about new things. And the tattoo is a new thing. What I have is I have a very large wolf on my chest. So it comes from just under my collarbone to below the sternum. So, I mean, it is a big tattoo, and I've got no other tattoos. So, you know, that it was a case of go big or go home. And as far as my tattooist was concerned, mine was a small tattoo. He often does the whole of the back right down, and including the buttocks as well. So, I mean, you know, mine was a small tattoo. And the wolf was something I was frightened of as a child. So it's telling me not to be frightened anymore. It has 1,001 different things it tells me. When I look in the mirror every morning, I see the wolf, and it reminds me I'll just give you that one example. There are about 5 or 6 other things. It reminds me not to be afraid. I was afraid of the pain that I would get having the tattoo, and I came out, just full of adrenaline for about the next 7 days. I was on this happy high.
Brilliant. That's really going for it. What's happiness to you, Andrew?
I'm finding this one difficult to answer because I sort of want to pull out the word happy, because there's a lot of research into how people think of their emotions. And one of the huge problems people have is they can't label their feelings very accurately. They can sort of label 5 feelings, which are happy, sad, angry, okay, and anxious. And I think that we have to define what you mean, because I think happy has about 3 or 4, 5, 10 different things in it. We've got contented, we've got feeling that our life is meaningful and purposeful. And, there's even things, and here's a good German word I learnt. There's no English equivalent for it. We feel Geborgenheit. And I think, a bit like Schadenfreude, we need to bring in this word, Geborgenheit. The literal translation is security, but it's actually much more than that. It's feeling enveloped in love. It's almost like that sort of feeling that a child has as it's just been fed, a small child that's just been fed by its mother. And they have this sort of, just deep wellness with the world. And that's Geborgenheit. So it sort of depends what you mean by happy.
Yeah, and where it actually comes from, and that idea. Just to give you the quick 30 seconds. Walking through town on a beautiful summer's day. I was on a good job, being paid well, company car, all that kind of stuff. And it was a May day, one of those rare early summer days where you're like looking forward to the summer. And my head was bursting and I was miserable. And I thought, I need to change this. So I wanted to make some changes to my life. I wanted to work in an environment where people were happy. It wasn't about hitting the numbers or making huge money, just a general atmosphere of happiness with colleagues, suppliers, clients. And we talk about those things as being part of our core values within Fusion. And this, in a way, brings me to the next question. You do need to win as well. You do need to pay your bills or achieve those objectives. So in a winning context for Andrew, what does winning look like for you at this stage?
Well, I hate the word win. I mean, I hate it with every bone of my body.
Well, welcome to the podcast.
Because, that suggests immediately a loser. And, I spend my whole life with couples where one of them is trying to get one up on the other, and it doesn't work. So I suppose I'm thinking in a much more whole way, what's actually working for everybody.
Well, maybe in that context, I can use the word achieve happy. And this analogy I give people is that you might love playing football and it gives you so much joy and so much pleasure. But if we were all out on the pitch kicking the ball to each other, it would become very pointless if there weren't goalposts. And, you put the ball in the back of the net, that feeling of, yes, I've achieved it. So maybe for you, what's achievement? What does achievement look like for you?
Well, I'm going to have to rebel yet again because
you're not an easy child.
I'm sorry, my parents were sports people, but actually they felt it was much better to have a good game. I mean, they played tennis, for example. Actually, who won is of very little importance. The fact that you've had lots of good rallies and you've enjoyed the afternoon together and you're going to have tea together in the clubhouse afterwards is far more important than who actually won the game.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, I've coached football teams, typical thing. Your son and he's on the team, and some fathers do need to put the hand up and volunteer. And I swear to God, there is such a difference between a team that win something and that doesn't. And I don't mean you have to win every match, and if you don't win, but the satisfaction of working hard to try and win a game, and you actually witness the change in these children when they've worked hard to get something and they've won a match. It doesn't have to be every match. And sometimes the winning of that match becomes even more satisfactory because you've lost all of the other ones. That's practicing together, training together to try and get better and better. And there's a goal, there's an objective at the end of it. You go, yes, that match was worth it. That day was worth it. That year's work was worth it. You know, those moments that give you satisfaction. And it's a little bit of payback for all that effort and toil you've put in there, you know, with that kind of clear objective.
I'm still having trouble.
You are a difficult child.
I can think, you know, obviously I would like to, you know, achievement, you know, my podcast has trillions of listeners, sort of kind of thing. But, and, you know, that would be nice, but the achievement is is talking to an interesting person. You know what?
That's winning.
Right. But I don't see that as an achievement. I see that as living fully in the moment. So, you know, what makes me happy, I can check, you know, am I happy talking to you now? Yes. I mean, I was asked by my business manager yesterday, what makes me happy when I look in my diary that day? And I say, well, actually, I feel happy every day. There's things I enjoy every day. You know, I was enjoying my business meeting with my business manager. You know, it was nice to see him. I was happy. So I'm thinking happiness is actually really, truly being in the moment, because this is magic that you and I are sitting here talking together today. And is this winning? I don't know. I don't care. I think what I care about is just being here with you.
Yeah. Okay. So is the being in those moments winning for you? Is that what?
I think ultimately I want to be rather than do, I think is possibly the difference. And so being in the moment, I mean, you know, my long-term ambition is to live in the eternal now. I mean, I'm doing hopelessly at it, but that would be my goal. You know, that would be an achievement for me if I can live in now. And so I'm just here with you now. I'm not thinking about, the client I'm going to be seeing in 45 minutes' time. Okay. You know, so suddenly I've come out of this glorious moment and my happiness level dropped down because I was thinking about the end of our interview.
Yeah.
And I've slightly spoilt the moment.
I read a lovely book by Benjamin Zander. It's called The Art of Possibility. I think he's the conductor of the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra, and he does a lot of teaching. And his goal every year with all of these young, talented musicians to bring them up to a really high spec, and he wants to pull them away from all of those kind of negative conversations. And one of the exercises he does at the beginning of a year or the beginning of a term, he gives everyone an A. And he asked them, what does an A look like for you? Can you imagine it? You know, it's a bit like a vision board. One of the things I do every year is I try to imagine the 23rd of December when you're closing the door of the office and it's been a good year. And if you can take a deep breath and say, yeah, that was a great year because. So what are the elements that would make that up? And it might be, and actually in some of my list is, yeah, I want really enjoyable conversations that I've captured on my podcast throughout the year. Yeah, things that and that for me is winning. You know, that's really, really cool. I want to get satisfaction from the work that we're doing with clients, that the work is meaningful and we're making a difference. I don't put financial goals in that. I never do because I'm not motivated by that at all. Now, having said that, you've got a responsibility towards the business to make sure you earn enough money to pay all the bills. And that gives me satisfaction, you know, having good colleagues, being able to reward them. So that financial part does a job. That for me is winning. And that's how I kind of play it back to you. I've a whopper of a question to close off on, if that's okay. You'll probably be a very bold boy with this one as well, and give me some reason why you shouldn't. And yeah, but maybe not. Maybe not. What was your best day ever?
I want to cop out and say today.
It's a really good question, Andrew, and I get some incredible responses from people from time to time. From time to time. A lot of people, and without a doubt, they'll say the day their child was born and all that kind of thing. It's a really interesting one. You might appreciate that people will say something to me like, it was a day when I was 8 years of age and I was swimming with my mother. And for some reason, I'll always remember that day because everything was just so perfect and I was so content. And I find in this big collective of our lives, this made up of moments and days and years and everything else, for anyone to be able to pinpoint those days and have that awareness with you at that moment that you can actually still recognize that that was an important day. I talk about a thing called perfect moments, when something is really nice, but you're self-aware to the point where you think, yeah, I actually really appreciate this moment. For some reason, it feels extra special and I'm fully aware of it.
So I could probably give you 1,000 days.
Okay.
Just last night, I was watching a documentary about Motown music when they came and they did their very first ever tour of the United Kingdom, and it was a complete and utter failure. And, the day I met Mary Wilson of the Supremes, and I had her on my radio program, and another day I was on the same television program on Channel 5, and we sat and chatted for about 45 minutes before we both appeared on the television program. Those were two fabulous days, but were they the best days of my life? I thought about the day I went and took a real life wolf for a walk through the English countryside. That was a highlight. I've just come back from Mexico, where we went into the depths of the rainforest and we went into these ancient ruins that had been reclaimed from the jungle, and we walked through the temple to the god of death. What an extraordinary experience that was. I could go on and on and on. I don't really feel that rating them is what does that do? My best day was when I was 8. Well, that's just a little bit sad, really, isn't it? Because I'd sort of rather like to think my best day is today, talking to you. I'm never going to have this moment again. And if we ever talk again, it will be a different conversation. This moment is the most precious one. And if we go deeply into this, we don't need Mary Wilson here. We don't need the jungle. We don't need a wolf. We just need to sit in this glorious moment.
And maybe sometimes when you reflect on those days that made you feel extra special for whatever was going on at the time, might give you just that little bit of a hint that maybe I should, do more of that this year, and not get caught up in lots of repeats. I've got a wonderful friend, hugely successful person. Like, when you think about best days, incredible achievements, let's put it that way. And he now is very, very slow to do anything new. He works all day, every day. And Saturdays and Sundays, he will go down there. Trying to get him to go to a different pub, a different restaurant, a different place. Let's go on a weekend away. Just won't do it. And I talk about, are we doing laps or are we going on a journey? That decision to move to Berlin, I thought, wow, well, you stopped doing laps. You decided, let's go on a journey. And I think that's incredible. And having that awareness about you and breaking out of those habits, maybe stopping happily pissed off, Andrew. What do you think?
I think that would be a great ambition. Either be genuinely pissed off and then do something about it.
Andrew, you've been a wonderful guest. You put me to the pin of my collar, and of course you asked me a lot of questions that I'll reflect on. I think for me personally, I think it affects everyone, that little 5-stage process I feel like this is one of the first conversations we'll have that is so valuable and useful. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much. For people who are interested in Andrew G. Marshall, and I know all of my listeners will be, where can they get more of you?
So I have a website, www.andrewgmarshall.com. The website will give you links to my podcast, which is The Meaningful Life with Andrew G. Marshall, where I talk to interesting people about what makes their life meaningful. I have a variety of books. I Love You, But I'm Not in Love with You is my most celebrated one. If your relationship is a good relationship and that's not relevant, the Happy Couples Handbook has a lot of the same sort of kind of ideas that I've given here. Lots of practical hacks to make your relationship better. So have a look at that. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I think I'm in LinkedIn as well. Not that I use it very much.
Andrew, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Win Happy podcast, which has been brought to you by Fusion Communications. If you'd like to get in touch, feel free to send me an email at greg@fusion.ie. So until next time, take it easy.